I spent hours combing through PSA and CGC's entire Wizards of the Coast first edition population reports, looking to prove once and for all which company grades vintage tougher, and the results were shocking, and not always what I expected. Of course, nothing is always black and white, yet there do seem to be some observable patterns and correlations that are worth discussing here. Anyway, I invite you to join me, Pokemon Classics, for a deep dive into grading. Before I get too far ahead of myself, let's rewind the clock. About a month ago, I made a video discussing the sudden drop in CGC 10 prices for many of the notable Wizards of the Coast chase cards immediately following CGC's decision to upgrade existing 9.5s to CGC 10s. In this video, I argued that these price drops were inevitable for what I felt and still feel is an obvious reason. Initial price memory for CGC 10s prior to the change when CGC 10s were incredibly difficult to grade, followed by a sudden saturation of new 10s on the market immediately after the free CGC 9.5 to 10 upgrade. In particular, the most volatile CGC 10 prices would belong to the cards that are traditionally the most difficult to grade, cards whose price stability largely depends on their scarcity. For years, the most difficult to grade Wizards of the Coast cards with the lowest populations have suffered from the same universal defect: holofoil print lines. These print lines are notorious in certain sets like Neo Genesis and Neo Revelation, but often affect various holographic cards with more hollow surface area and lighter transparent holofoil backgrounds. Simply put, more hollow surface area leaves more opportunity for print lines, and lighter holofoil backgrounds render them more visible. But this brings us to the point of my previous video. Once CGC upgraded existing 9.5s to CGC 10s, many of these cards that had previously had a reputation for being impossible to grade in gem mint condition due to the prevalence of print lines exploded in population and availability almost instantly. In many cases, a CGC 10 went from being significantly more elusive than a PSA 10 to much more common, and at least to some degree, CGC 10 price volatility reflected this volatility in supply. I tried to show this in my last video comparing the population reports of the cards traditionally most susceptible to print lines, and in every case, the CGC gem mint rates were significantly higher. Now, apparently this video was more controversial than I realized or than I intended. There were a handful of upset comments and criticisms, some of which were simply illogical, but others had some valid points regarding the data set that I used. So today we're going through all of the data, not just a handful of cards. But before we do, I should offer the following disclaimers. First, I'm not affiliated with either grading company, though I do prefer PSA. For those of you that are new to my channel, I've been collecting and grading cards and trying to complete vintage Wizards of the Coast sets with PSA since 2011. So I'm much more familiar with PSA and prefer to have some consistency within my own personal collection. It's really a personal preference. I've also said this on my channel numerous times, but I think CGC has the most attractive slab on the market, and although I am critical of some of the changes they've instituted to their grading scale over the last 3 years, I also think they offer needed competition in the market. With lower prices, faster turnaround time, and a much more active role in researching and authenticating cards, they're also a valid option for collectors. I should also acknowledge that this video is exclusively about vintage Wizards of the Coast cards. I only collect vintage, and my experience with modern and Japanese cards is far too limited for me to provide meaningful insight or commentary into those areas of the market. Anecdotally, I have seen data suggesting much higher gem rates for these submarkets in PSA than in CGC, but I'm just not familiar enough with the print quality of these cards or which cards or sets traditionally suffer most from which types of production issues. Also, I want to provide a quick shout out to DeGreen Shiz, a friend and fellow collector whose video on this topic inspired me to make this follow-up. Definitely go check out his channel too. I'll leave a link to it down in the description below. So with the disclaimers out of the way, let's go ahead and roll into the data. For the first few Wizards of the Coast sets on this list, I've noticed little statistical difference between PSA 10s and CGC 10s, and I suspect that's because these sets suffered from several known production issues, including poor centering and dots of edgeware straight out of the pack. Now, I can only speculate on a reason for this, but I think a good theory is the high volume of cards being printed and the lack of experience with production. Anyway, the earliest cards, including first edition base set, are some of the hardest cards to grade, and even the range of gem rates is pretty consistent for both companies. A couple notable outliers include Machamp, which is difficult to validate given the inconsistent designation as either shadowless or unlimited, and the CGC 10 Nidoking, with only 2 copies in CGC 10. I'd have to verify this with some data, but I think this Nidoking is the lowest gem rate of any first edition Wizard of the Coast holo graded by CGC, which is pretty unexpected. As for print lines, the one card that is notorious for print lines in this set is Chansey, with its light holofoil surface. This happens to be the most difficult card to grade in PSA at 2.41% in Gem Mint 10, which is notably higher than CGC's 4.56%. Given the other production quality issues, though, I'm not sure Chansey alone is sufficient to prove that print lines are responsible for this lower rate. After all, first edition base set has a lot of other condition issues that we should consider. Like first edition base set, Jungle set suffered from many of the same production issues, plus one new one. Not only were the cuts often uncentered or prone to dots of edge wear, but many Jungle holos seem to have been cut with dull blades, leaving the front edges susceptible to chipping right out of the pack. In less severe cases, the borders remain fully intact, but a visible shine can be seen along the edges. Because of these production issues, Jungle is also one of the most consistent sets in terms of gem rate, and one of the most difficult sets to grade with either company. In fact, almost every Jungle holo is among the most difficult first edition Wizard of the Coast holos to grade in CGC 10. Nevertheless, there are 3 holos that have traditionally been plagued by print lines too, making them even more difficult to grade and historically more valuable. They include Kangaskhan, Snorlax, and Vaporeon. There are a few others, but not nearly as notable as these 3. The PSA 10 population is a bit more difficult to grade, but not significantly so, which is likely attributable to the other known print issues that are also limiting the number of viable 10s. Fossil set is where production quality starts to noticeably improve in the Wizards of the Coast timeline, a trend which we'll see continue into later sets. However, there's also some compelling data here alluding to each company's handling of print lines. In particular, the 2 most susceptible to print line cards are Articuno and Lapras, both of which have a much lower PSA 10 gem rate comparatively to many of the other holos in their respective set. In fact, if you look at the range in the PSA chart, the cards that grade easiest are almost exclusively cards that have dark holofoil backgrounds, led by Muck and Magneton, which are 4 to 6 times easier to grade than Articuno or Lapras in PSA. CGC, on the other hand, has a much narrower range, seemingly not acknowledging these differences in difficulty. Now, this suggests one of 2 things must be true. Either PSA is actively suppressing grades on some of the lighter holofoil cards out there over the dark holofoil backgrounds, or print lines don't factor as heavily into CGC's assessment. It's especially interesting that Articuno, one of the most difficult cards to grade by either company, is almost double the gem rate in CGC, and Lapras, arguably the most affected by print lines, has the exact same CGC gem rate as Magneton. Again, this just seems off to me. Team Rocket is an interesting set for a number of reasons, one of which is that 4 of the 5 most difficult cards to grade with each grading company happen to be the same. Before we unpack that data, a few comments on production quality. So far, the average gem rate has gradually been improving for both companies, as presumably production quality has also improved and been refined over time. However, this is one of the most polarizing sets, demonstrating how harshly print lines can affect PSA's grading. The range in gem rate for PSA is 2.03% at the low end for Dark Magneton, and as high as 30.39% for Here Comes Team Rocket on the high end. Now, Here Comes Team Rocket has almost no holofoil exposed, similar to Dark Weezing and Rocket Sneak Attack, which are also over 15% in PSA gem rate. On the other hand, Dark Magneton, which is one of the hardest Wizards of the Coast holos to grade, has a lot of holofoil surface and is well known for print lines. This is also true of Rainbow Energy, which is why both have typically carried a significant premium, despite not being as popular as other cards in the set. Now, both of these cards are just slightly easier to grade with CGC, but not significantly so. In fact, most of the cards are close, with many being slightly more difficult to grade with CGC. The exception here seems to be cards like Dark Weezing, Here Comes Team Rocket, and Rocket Sneak Attack, mentioned earlier, which are about twice as difficult in CGC as they are in PSA. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this, but it seems to suggest some other criteria, outside of print lines, that CGC is grading more harshly than PSA, perhaps centering or corners. But considering Team Rocket is generally a set which has a really good production quality, this is interesting, especially in contrast to the next few sets. Gym Heroes is the set where CGC standards become more of a mystery to me. As has been the trend, overall gem rates continue to improve as we've progressed, but the spike in gem rates for CGC is something I struggle to fully understand here. Historically speaking, Gem Heroes is a well-produced set, but also has a few cards that are notably more difficult to grade due to print lines. For both companies, light-foiled cards like Blaine's Moltres, Sabrina's Gengar, and Brock are among the most difficult to grade. However, the difference in gem rate between the two companies is pretty significant in this set. Every card in CGC has a double-digit gem rate, and over half are above 20%. Meanwhile, we once again see the easiest cards to grade with PSA are those with dark holofoil patterns like Lieutenant Surge's Electabuzz and the Rocket's Trap, which are 4 to 5 times easier to grade than the most difficult ones. On average, PSA gem rates are slightly improved when compared to the Team Rocket set we looked at earlier, but gem rates more than double with CGC. I'm not sure what to make of this, if there are some subtle defect from earlier sets that were suddenly corrected here with Gem Heroes, or some other explanation. As we'll see moving forward, Gem Heroes, for whatever reason, happens to be the easiest Wizards of the Coast set to grade with CGC. Inversely, Gym Challenge is the easiest set to grade in PSA 10, and with the exception of a few cards that are notoriously difficult to grade, you'll notice significantly higher gem rates in PSA for almost every card. This actually fits my thesis about print lines, as Gym Challenge is a set known for two things: dark holofoil backgrounds and large Pokemon illustrations covering most of the holo. Cards like Giovanni's Machamp, Giovanni's Nidoking, Lieutenant Surge's Raichu, and Koga's Ditto have very little exposed holofoil, while cards like Brock's Ninetales, Giovanni, and Sabrina are dark and less susceptible to print lines. These are among the easiest cards in all of Wizards of the Coast to grade in PSA 10, with gem rates all over 25%. However, the cards with light holofoil patterns and smaller illustrations aren't nearly as fortunate. Giovanni's Persian, Misty's Golduck, and Erica's Venusaur are each below 6% and are 5 to 6 times less likely to grade a PSA 10. This trend is also observable, but to a lesser degree, with CGC. These lighter holofoiled cards are still difficult, but much easier to grade with CGC than PSA, once again suggesting less emphasis on print lines, assuming that's the only flaw. I'm also not sure how to account for this discrepancy either, but over half of Gem Heroes holos have a CGC gem rate of 20% or higher, but none do in Gym Challenge. Not a single one. I can only assume that CGC leans more heavily on some other flaw, like PSA does with print lines, but I can't discern what that flaw could be, especially in comparison to Gym Heroes, which are generally comparable in cut and centering as sets. The Neo sets, Neo Genesis in particular, mark an interesting turning point in production quality. At least when it comes to PSA, every set had gotten progressively easier to grade as Wizards of the Coast refined their quality control, with one notable exception: print lines. This set is arguably the most difficult to grade in PSA, with over half of its holos experiencing a gem rate of under 3%. The most difficult cards to grade also happen to be the ones with light holofoil surfaces that are susceptible to print lines. Unfortunately, this is quite a few cards in the set. It's Typhlosion number 17, Slowking, Lugia, Feraligatr, Pichu. Even less desirable cards like Heracross, Azumarill, and Metal Energy aren't immune to this. It's no coincidence that the only two holos with a gem rate over 10% are Ampharos and Steelix, both of which have solid black backgrounds. Looking at CGC though, it's clear that there's a different standard at play, at least when it comes to print lines. The top 4 most difficult cards from the set in CGC 10 are also among the most difficult in PSA, but the difference in gem rate is substantial. The fact that neither Typhlosion 17 nor Slowking is even represented in the top 5 most difficult cards from CGC is really inexplicable. The only two explanations are that either PSA is intentionally suppressing the populations of about 2/3 of this set, or that print lines aren't as restrictive under CGC's grading scale. Neo Discovery isn't nearly as depressing as Neo Genesis, but it still reflects a similar pattern of grading difficulty. At least for PSA, the difficult cards are the ones with susceptibility to print lines: Yanma, Houndour, Smeargle being the most lamented over, and the easier ones, Magnemite and Forretress, having black and mostly obscured holofoil backgrounds. Interestingly, this is one of the most polarizing sets for CGC when it comes to gem rates, with a handful of holos all below 7% in gem rate, and over half above 12%. This isolation of specifically difficult to grade cards isn't as common with CGC as it is with PSA. It's really not a bad thing, it's just an interesting observation. Anyway, the 3 cards that appear on both top 5 lists are Yanma, Smeargle, and Politoed, with the first 2 being a few percentage points easier to grade with CGC than PSA, and the third a percentage point easier to grade with PSA than CGC. Overall, these differences seem negligible. However, one data point that is interesting to me, though admittedly anecdotal, is the Houndour. It's one of the most difficult cards to grade in PSA 10 at 4.39%, and one of the easiest cards to grade in CGC 10 at 15.09%. Again, I'm not really sure what to make of this, but out of all the cards in the set, it's the one with the greatest discrepancy. Like Neogenesis, Neo Revelation is another set that is historically difficult to grade in PSA 10, with 8 of its 14 holos holding a gem rate under 4%. Amongst the most difficult cards in the set, and all of Wizards of the Coast, are Ampharos, Blissey, Misdreavus, Houndoom, and Magneton, each of which earn a pretty substantial premium due to their scarcity. As is with the theme of PSA, cards with darker holofoil backgrounds like Crobat and Celebi, and cards that have little visible holofoil like Delibird and Jumpluff are traditionally much easier to grade, and are each at about 10% in gem rate when it comes to PSA. Also continuing the theme of this video is the noticeably easier gem rate for these chase cards with CGC. In the case of Blissey and Ampharos and Houndoom, all 3 are present in CGC's top 5 most difficult to grade cards, but are still 2 to 4 times easier to grade with CGC than PSA. In fact, the only cards with a lower gem rate with CGC are the ones with large illustrations and dark holofoil backgrounds. Don't get me wrong, CGC gem rate is still quite low for this entire set, all below 8%. But once again, this suggests a greater tolerance for print lines. Finally, we'll take a look at the most interesting comparison, Neo Destiny. Now, the disparity between PSA and CGC is most profound here, and although I can't prove why this discrepancy exists, I have my theories. Looking at the charts, you'll notice that every single Neo Destiny holo is easier to grade in PSA than CGC, by a significant margin. In fact, this is one of the easiest sets to grade in PSA, and one of the hardest sets to grade with CGC. But why? The PSA gem rates align closely with Gym Challenge, while the CGC gem rates align closely with Jungle. I think, and this is just my speculation, that the focus on how each company grades certain types of imperfections is on display here better than on any other set. Let me unpack this. Neo Destiny is not known for print lines. Like Gym Challenge, most of the cards have large illustrations that take up most of the artwork, along with darker and busier holo backgrounds. Light Togetic is the one obvious exception, but even Togetic has not been nearly as susceptible as some of the others we've seen throughout this study. However, Neo Destiny does have a well-documented production quirk, and it has to do with the edges. Similar to Jungle, but nowhere near as noticeable or as extreme, is a slight silvering of the edges. I'm not talking about traditional edgeware here where the yellow borders have chipping on them, or where the holo is obviously exposed, but rather a type of glinting or glittering of the holofoil layer just visible from the side of the card. I suspect that PSA doesn't quantify this as damage, but that CGC does. Again, it's just a theory, but given the huge disparity, it might help understand this difference. Looking back, there are 2 strong correlations that I hope this video highlights. Number 1, most vintage cards with light holofoil backgrounds and large holofoil surface areas are significantly more difficult to grade in PSA 10 than cards with less holofoil and darker backgrounds. This is a well-established observation amongst vintage collectors that certain cards are more susceptible to print lines and therefore tougher to grade. However, and this is number 2, this trend is not observable with CGC holos. Every one of these cards has a higher gem rate with CGC, and some aren't even among the most difficult cards to grade with CGC within their respective sets. This suggests that holofoil print lines are not factored to the same extreme by CGC as they are with PSA. To me, this makes sense. CGC is a different grading system which averages subscores, allowing cards to still potentially earn 9.5s or now 10s due to the upgrade if their only flaw is a slight downgrade in its surface score. I think this is the point that most people missed in my previous video, and to be fair, I don't think I articulated as clearly as I intended. But when looking at the price volatility of certain CGC cards, gem rates and populations can make a big difference. For many of these traditionally low population cards, their prices were high due to the perception of scarcity. Not only were PSA 10 copies difficult to grade and scarce on the market, but prior to CGC's shift, they were even more difficult to grade or find in a CGC 10. If somebody wanted a Gem Mint 10 Slowking or Lugia, there weren't many options available, But with the upgrades of CGC 9.5s to 10s, suddenly the population doubled, tripled, or quadrupled, with many hitting the market at almost the same time, almost immediately after. That's just not a winning formula for price stability, at least not in the short term. Again, I'm not opposed to CGC, and I see a lot of value in the company and believe that market competition is good for the consumer. CGC has an attractive slab, better pricing and turnaround times, and is more actively involved in research and authentication than PSA could ever hope to be, all of which are great qualities to have. However, I am critical of their decision and the level of volatility it unleashed into the secondary markets. I don't think that was healthy. So let me amend my statement from my previous video and say it this way. Before you buy CGC or PSA cards, be aware how each company grades cards and about the cards that you're grading. Different cards suffer from different issues, and different companies apply different criteria when actually grading those cards. Also, be aware of how supply fluctuations can affect value. Generally speaking, supply volatility, like we've seen with CGC, will also result in price volatility. Finally, and most importantly, collect what you want to collect. Raw or graded, modern or vintage, CGC or PSA, there's plenty of room in this hobby for everyone. It doesn't all have to be the same. As always, I welcome your feedback and observations down in the comments below. Even those of you who disagree with me or are looking to vilify me for my observations and opinions, you guys are welcome here too. I'm a teacher, I can handle the criticism. It's part of my daily life. Anyway, the fight over modern and vintage, or which grading company is inherently superior to the others, is ultimately one of subjective preference, and it doesn't always have to be adversarial or as polarizing. So I guess in short, what I'm trying to say is pursue your passions, people. Anyway, guys, I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. Till next time, everybody, stay well, enjoy collecting. Bye, everybody.